I am your host, Miss Marple. Let's begin our journey.
The village of St. Mary Mead was, on this particular autumn Saturday, a riot of russet, gold, and the smell of wood smoke. The village square had been transformed for the annual harvest festival, a tradition that stood as firm as the stone walls of the Norman church overlooking the green. Long trestle tables groaned under the weight of oversized marrows, jars of clear honey, and the vicar's wife's famous ginger cake. It was the sort of afternoon where the only anticipated drama was whether Mrs. Price Ridley's damson jam would finally unseat Miss Weatherby's perennial first prize conserve. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in a sensible tweed coat and carrying a basket for her small purchases, moved through the crowd with a gentle nodding grace. To the casual eye, she was merely another elderly lady admiring the chrysanthemums. In reality, her pale blue eyes were working with the precision of a master watchmaker. She noted the way young Dickie Tarrant, the village's resident bad boy, kept checking his pocket watch, and the unnatural paleness of Helena Crane, the local schoolmistress, whose hands trembled as she pinned a sold ticket onto a crate of apples. The centre of attention, however, was Sir George Abernathy. As the local squire and chief benefactor of the parish, Sir George was a man of immense presence and even greater ego. He stood upon a makeshift wooden dais in the centre of the square, preparing to give the opening address. Sir George was a man who enjoyed the sound of his own voice, a booming baritone that had echoed through the halls of Parliament before his retirement. "Friends, neighbours," Sir George began, adjusting his spectacles, "we gather once more to celebrate the bounty of our soil. In these uncertain times, it is the stability of the village, the loyalty of its people, that provides our true strength." Miss Marple noticed a flicker of movement in the shadow of the old elm behind the dais. A man she didn't recognize, tall, wearing a frayed mackintosh, was watching Sir George with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. Miss Marple's knitting pattern memory clicked. He reminded her of a disgruntled footman she had once known in Bournemouth, a man who had nursed a grievance for 20 years before finally throwing a boot at his master. "But loyalty," Sir George continued, his voice taking on a sharper edge, "must be earned, and I have recently discovered that some among us have forgotten the meaning of the word. Secrets, no matter how deeply buried, have a way of—" He stopped abruptly. His face, usually a healthy florid pink, turned a startling shade of mulberry. He clutched the edge of the podium, his knuckles turning white. A small, confused murmur rose from the crowd. "Sir George?" The vicar stepped forward, his brow furrowed with concern. Sir George did not answer. He took one shuddering breath, his eyes wide and fixed on something or someone directly in front of him. Then, with a sound like a falling tree, he collapsed. He didn't just fall, he seemed to buckle under an invisible blow, tumbling off the dais and landing amongst a display of prize-winning pumpkins. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant caw of a crow. Then chaos erupted. Dr. Haydock pushed through the throng, but one look at the squire's distorted features told the story. Miss Marple remained still, her gaze not on the fallen man, but on the glass of water sitting untouched on the podium's edge. She noticed a very fine, almost invisible dusting of white powder on the dark wood of the dais, right where Sir George had been resting his hand. It was a detail so small it would be swept away by the wind within minutes, yet in Miss Marple's mind it was as loud as a gunshot. The harvest festival is over. The village square, a place of community and celebration, had become a crime scene. And as Miss Marple watched the panicked faces of her neighbours, she realised that Sir George's unfinished sentence had been the most dangerous thing he had ever said. By the time the evening shadows had lengthened across the cobblestones of St. Mary Mead, the shocking collapse of Sir George Abernathy had transformed from a medical emergency into a full-blown scandal. The village square once vibrant with the colours of the harvest, was now a hushed theatre of suspicion. While the police had removed the body and cordoned off the dais with a grim efficiency that felt foreign to the peaceful setting, the real investigation was taking place behind the floral curtains of the local cottages and over the polished counters of the Blue Boar. Gossip in St. Mary Mead did not merely travel, it fermented. Each retelling of the event added a new layer of intrigue, a sharper edge to a motive, or a more dramatic interpretation of Sir George's final choked words. In the post office, Mrs. Price Ridley was already holding court, her voice a sharp staccato that cut through the afternoon air. She insisted, with the authority of someone who had once seen a play about the Borgias, that it was clearly a case of a vengeful heart attack brought on by the sight of someone he hated. "He looked right at someone, I tell you," she declared to a captive audience of the chemist and the butcher's assistant. "He said the word secrets, and his heart simply gave out from the strain of his own indignation. It's what happens when a man of his standing is forced to associate with the less savoury elements of the parish." Her gaze drifted significantly toward the doorway, where Dickie Tarrant was seen leaning against a lamp-post, smoking a cigarette with an air of studied indifference. Dickie, the black sheep of a respectable family, had long been Sir George's loudest critic, especially after the squire had threatened to evict his mother from her cottage for unpaid rent. The village collective mind immediately began to weave a narrative of a desperate son protecting his home, though how he might have caused a man to drop dead from 10 feet away remained a secondary concern to the richness of the motive. Miss Marple, meanwhile, sat quietly in the corner of the tea-room, her knitting needles clicking a steady, thoughtful rhythm. She was surrounded by the chatter of Miss Weatherby and Miss Hartnell, who were debating whether the squire's secrets referred to the rumours of a missing emerald necklace from the Abernathy estate, or perhaps something more personal involving the schoolmistress, Helena Crane. "Did you see her face, Jane?" Miss Weatherby whispered, leaning in so close her lavender scent was almost overwhelming. She turned the colour of parchment, and she's been seen walking near the manor woods at very odd hours. They say Sir George was going to replace her at the school, something about a lack of moral standing in her past. Miss Marple nodded absently, her mind sifting through the layers of village logic. She knew that in a place like St. Mary Mead, people rarely lied about their feelings, but they almost always lied about their reasons. To Miss Weatherby, a pale face meant a guilty conscience. To Miss Marple, it often meant a person who had seen something they were not supposed to see. She pondered the secrets Sir George had mentioned. A man of his ego wouldn't just announce he had discovered a secret, he would brandish it like a weapon. He had been enjoying the moment, relishing the power it gave him over the crowd, right up until the moment that power was stripped away. The theories continued to proliferate. The vicar's wife suggested a tragic accident involving the new pesticide Sir George had been testing on his prize-winning marrows, while the local blacksmith hinted at a more sinister curse connected to the squire's recent decision to close the public footpath through the lower meadow. Each theory was flawed, built on a foundation of personal bias and half-remembered observations, yet each revealed a hidden fissure in the village's social structure. "It's the Mackintosh man," whispered a voice near the window. It was Mrs. Gable, the butcher's wife. "The stranger by the tree, no one knows him. He looked like death himself. He disappeared the moment Sir George fell. If you ask me, he was a professional from London, hired by someone who couldn't do the job themselves." This new theory caught fire instantly. A stranger was always a more comfortable villain than a neighbour. It allowed the villagers to maintain the illusion of their own innocence, while indulging in the thrill of a mystery. They began to recall every detail of the man, the frayed sleeves of his coat, the way he didn't join in the applause, the grim set of his jaw. He became a ghost, a phantom assassin who had vanished into the autumn mist. Miss Marple listened to the mounting excitement with a slight, troubled frown. She remembered the Mackintosh man, certainly. He had stood with the stillness of a man who had nowhere else to go. But she also remembered the dusting of white powder on the dais, a detail no one else seemed to have noticed in the scramble to reach the fallen squire. She thought of a similar incident years ago involving a disgraced gardener and a bowl of poisoned sugar. It hadn't been a stranger who had placed the bowl. It had been someone who knew exactly how much sugar the master took in his tea. "The village is like a pond, Jerry," she murmured to young Mr. Burton when he stopped by her table to offer a lift home. "When a stone is thrown in, the mud at the bottom always comes to the surface. Everyone is so busy looking at the mud that they forget to look at who threw the stone." As the evening bells began to toll, the village of St. Mary Mead settled into a restless sleep. The harvest festival had been intended to celebrate the fruits of the earth, but it had instead yielded a harvest of suspicion. The gossip would continue to swirl, the theories would grow more elaborate, and the police would look for the obvious. But Miss Marple knew that the answer was not to be found in the disappearance of a stranger or the anger of a young man. It was hidden in the ordinary habits of ordinary people, the subtle patterns of behavior that only someone who had spent a lifetime watching the neighbors could truly understand. The morning after the tragedy, the village square felt curiously hollow, like a stage after the actors had departed. The police tape around the dais strained and hummed in a sharp autumnal breeze, and the prize-winning pumpkins, once the pride of the parish, now sat rotting and ignored. Inspector Slack had arrived from the county town with a great deal of bustle, his boots clicking authoritatively on the stones as he interviewed the most prominent witnesses. To Slack, the case was a matter of physical evidence and direct opportunity. He was currently obsessed with the glass of water Sir George had intended to drink, which had been sent to the lab, and the identity of the mysterious man in the mackintosh. Miss Marple, however, was not concerned with mackintoshes or lab results just yet. She sat on a bench near the lich gate of the church, her knitting bag at her side, though her needles were momentarily still. She was practicing the art of being invisible, an art at which she excelled. When one is an elderly lady of modest means and gentle demeanour, people tend to talk over and around you as if you were a piece of furniture. It was in this state of perceived insignificance that she observed the subtle rhythmic patterns of village life that had been knocked out of alignment. She watched the apothecary, Mr. Cherrington, as he opened his shop. Usually a man of painful punctuality, he had fumbled with his keys for nearly a minute, his eyes darting toward the manor house on the hill. When he finally entered, he did not turn the open sign for another quarter of an hour. Miss Marple noted that he was wearing a mismatched pair of socks, a triviality to some, but to her it suggested a mind so gripped by internal turmoil that the basic mechanics of dressing had failed. Mr. Cherrington was a man who prided himself on his precision. Such a lapse was as loud as a scream. Moments later, Helena Crane, the schoolmistress, crossed the square. She was walking with her head down, her gait hurried and uneven. Miss Marple observed that Helena did not stop to look at the cordoned-off dais, as everyone else did. In fact, she pointedly turned her head away, her body stiffening as she passed the spot where the squire had fallen. This was a deviation from the village reacts pattern. Human nature dictates a morbid fascination with the sight of a disaster. To avoid it so completely suggests not only grief, but a profound, visceral fear. "Good morning, Helena," Miss Marple called softly as the younger woman neared her bench. Helena startled, her hand flying to her throat. "Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't see you there. It's a dreadful morning, isn't it?" "Dreadful indeed, my dear," Miss Marple replied, her voice a soothing murmur. "The loss of Sir George is a great blow to the parish. He was a man of such firm convictions. I was just thinking of his speech. It's a pity he didn't finish it. He seemed very eager to share his discovery." Helena's eyes flickered with a desperate trapped light. "He was a man who enjoyed making others uncomfortable, Miss Marple. I'm not sure his discovery would have brought anyone peace." She didn't wait for a reply, practically fleeing toward the schoolhouse. Miss Marple watched her go, a small pensive frown appearing on her face. She then turned her attention to the vicar's wife, who was tidying the nearby flower beds. Mrs. Clement was a woman who knew the domestic interior of every house in the village. Miss Marple engaged her in a conversation about the upcoming winter charity drive, gradually steering the talk toward the Abernathy household. "I hear the squire's niece Adelaide arrived from London late last night," Miss Marple remarked. "Such a difficult time for a young woman to inherit such a large responsibility." Mrs. Clement leaned on her trowel. "Difficulty isn't the word I'd use, Jane. Adelaide has always looked at that manor as if it were a prison. But did you hear? She didn't come alone. She brought that young solicitor with her, the one Sir George had threatened to sue last year over the estate boundaries. They were seen arguing in the hallway of the manor not an hour after the body was taken away. This was a pattern Miss Marple recognized well. It was the pattern of the inconvenient benefactor. Sir George had been a man who controlled people through their pockets and their reputations. When such a man dies, the grief is often a thin veil over an immense sense of relief. Miss Marple thought back to a similar case in her own family. Great-aunt Fanny, who had controlled the family's inheritance with a rod of iron until she choked on a piece of peppermint. The family had wept at the funeral, but they had bought new motor cars within the month. As the morning progressed, Miss Marple noted one final pattern. Dickie Tarrant, the obvious suspect in the eyes of the village, was making no effort to hide. In fact, he was being deliberately conspicuous, helping the verger clear away the heavy trestle tables from the square. He was working with a grim, defiant energy, as if he wanted everyone to see that his hands were dirty from honest labor. "He's playing a part, Jane," Miss Hartnell whispered, joining Miss Marple on the bench. "Trying to look helpful so we won't notice he's the only one who truly gained from the squire's death." Miss Marple smiled gently but said nothing. She was thinking of the dusting of white powder she had seen on the dais. It hadn't been on the glass, but on the wood where Sir George had rested his hands. In her experience, when a man of Sir George's age and health dies so suddenly after mentioning secrets, the cause is rarely as simple as what a stranger does or what an angry young man shouts. It is usually found in the quiet, everyday things, the things that have been in plain sight for years, waiting for someone to notice they have been moved. She stood up, brushing a stray bit of wool from her coat. She had seen enough one morning. The village was looking for a villain in a mackintosh, but Miss Marple was looking for something much more common, a person who had been pushed to the very edge of their endurance by a man who didn't know when to stop talking. The following afternoon, the heavy, bureaucratic hand of Inspector Slack descended upon St. Mary Mead with a finality that made the village hold its collective breath. By 3 o'clock, the obvious had been codified into an arrest warrant. To the police, the narrative was as clean as a freshly swept doorstep. Dickie Tarrant, the hot-headed youth with a motive as wide as the village green, had been taken into custody. The evidence, as Slack loudly explained to the vicar over the garden wall, was damningly circumstantial yet locally irrefutable. A search of the Tarrant cottage had revealed a small, half-empty bottle of a potent digitalis-based heart stimulant, medication belonging to his mother, but missing a significant portion of its contents. Slack's theory was a masterpiece of simplicity. Dickie, desperate to save his mother from eviction and fueled by a lifetime of resentment against the squire's tyrannical grip, had smeared the concentrated liquid onto the wooden edge of the podium where Sir George always rested his hands. The squire, a man known for the nervous habit of rubbing his face and mouth during his long-winded orations, would have ingested the toxin almost instantly. It was a poor man's crime, Slack called it, utilizing the tools at hand to strike down a giant. The village reaction was a mix of horrified vindication and a strange, hollow disappointment. While many had whispered Dickie's name, seeing the boy actually led away in handcuffs felt like a betrayal of the town's own soul. Mrs. Price Ridley felt her theories had been proven correct, while others, like the schoolmistress Helena Crane, seemed to shrink even further into the shadows her face appearing like a ghost behind the schoolroom window. Miss Marple sat in her small parlour, the tea cooling in her cup, while her friend, Mrs. Bantry, paced the rug with indignant energy. "It's too neat, Jane. That boy is a rebel, yes, and he's got a temper like a forest fire, but he's not a poisoner. He's the sort to punch a man in the jaw in the middle of the street, not slip something onto a podium like a thief in the night." "I quite agree, Dolly," Miss Marple replied, her knitting needles clicking with a rhythmic, thoughtful pace. "Dickie Tarrant is a young man of many faults, but he possesses a certain transparency. He wears his anger like a badge. A poisoner, however, must possess a very specific kind of patience. They must be able to sit at a tea table and smile at the person they intend to destroy. They must have a mind that can calculate the exact moment of a man's collapse while discussing the price of wool." Miss Marple looked out at her garden, where the autumn leaves were performing a frantic dance in the wind. She was thinking about digitalism. It was a clever touch, almost too clever. If one wanted to frame a boy whose mother was known to take heart medication, it was the perfect weapon. But it was the white powder she had seen that continued to haunt her thoughts. Digitalis in its medicinal form was a liquid or a tiny pill. It did not leave a fine crystalline dust on a wooden dais. "Inspector Slack is very proud of himself," Miss Marple continued softly. "He sees a boy with a motive and a bottle of medicine, and he thinks he has found the centre of the web. But he has forgotten Squire's niece, Adelaide, and that sharp-featured solicitor. He has forgotten Mr. Cherrington's mismatched socks, and the way the school mistress cannot look at a pumpkin without trembling. He is looking at the person who had the most reason to hate Sir George, rather than the person who had the most reason to fear him." Later that evening, Miss Marple made a point of walking past the Tarrant cottage. The windows were dark, save for one small lamp in the kitchen where Dickie's mother sat alone. It was a picture of misery that struck Miss Marple as deeply wrong. She remembered a similar case in the village of Nethercompton years ago. A young man had been accused of stealing church money because he had been seen near the vestry with a crowbar. It turned out he was merely trying to break into the cellar to keep a tryst with the milkmaid. The real thief had been the verger, a man so respectable that no one had thought to check his pockets. Police were keen to close the case. The Mackintosh man had been dismissed as a vagrant who had moved on to the next county, and with Dickie in a cell, the village was expected to return to its quiet routine. But St. Mary Mead's air remained heavy. There was a sense that the squire's secrets were still hovering over the square, unsaid and potent. "If you shut a door too quickly, Dolly," Miss Marple said to Mrs. Bantry as she saw her to the gate, "you often find that you've trapped something inside with you. The inspector has shut the door on Dickie Tarrant, but the real killer is still walking our lanes, perhaps feeling very relieved, or perhaps, and this is much more dangerous, feeling very successful. A person who has killed once and gotten away with it often feels a strange sense of omnipotence. They begin to think they are the masters of the village." Miss Marple watched her friend's car disappear into the dusk. She knew that she must move carefully. She was an old woman, and her only weapons were observation and an understanding of the darker corners of the human heart. She needed to look beyond the obvious, beyond the digitalis and the angry boy, and find the person who had sat in the front row of the harvest festival, watching the squire's face for the first sign of the mulberry tint. She needed to find the person who knew exactly what Sir George had been about to say, and why it was worth a life to stop him. The morning after Dickie Tarrant's arrest, St. Mary Mead seemed to be trying very hard to convince itself that justice had been served. The shopkeepers swept their doorsteps with a bit more vigour, and the talk at the post office was of the upcoming winter pageant. However, Miss Marple was not a woman who allowed herself to be lulled by a change in social tempo. She spent her morning in a manner that would have baffled Inspector Slack. She went to the village library and asked to see the local newspaper archives from exactly 12 years ago, and then she paid a visit to the churchyard to look at a grave that most people had forgotten. The grave belonged to a young man named Arthur Crane, the brother of the current schoolmistress, who had died in a tragic drowning accident during a summer rowing trip. Miss Marple stood by the headstone, her eyes following the moss-covered letters. She remembered the event vaguely, a summer of heat waves and local sorrow. But it wasn't the tragedy itself that interested her. It was the date. It coincided exactly with a period when Sir George Abernathy had been abroad on a diplomatic mission that had ended abruptly. Returning to the village square, she found herself standing near the very spot where the squire had fallen. The police had removed the tape, but the phantom of the event remained. Miss Marple knelt down, ostensibly to adjust the hem of her coat, but her fingers were exploring the base of the wooden dais. Everyone was looking for a bottle or a syringe, but Miss Marple was looking for a scent. She leaned in close to the wood where the white powder had been, and there it was, the faint, unmistakable odour of almond and bitter cherry. It was a scent she knew well, but not from a medicine bottle. It was the smell of a specific type of photographic developer, one used by high-end amateurs who preferred the old-fashioned chemical methods of bringing a negative to life. Miss Marple sat back on her heels, her mind clicking through the villagers like a deck of cards. Who in St. Mary Mead was a photographer? The answer was surprising. The apothecary, Mr. Cherrington, was a known enthusiast, but so was Adelaide, Squire's niece. However, it wasn't the photography itself that was the hidden clue. It was a chemical property. Certain developers, if mixed with a common household cleaning agent, created a volatile crystalline powder that was highly toxic if absorbed through the skin, but vanished almost completely when exposed to moisture, such as the perspiration on a nervous speaker's hands. It was an ingenious intellectual murder method far beyond the reach of a boy like Dickie Tarrant. As she walked home, Miss Marple detoured through the schoolhouse garden. She saw Helena crane through the open window, sitting at her desk with a stack of unmarked papers. Helena looked like a woman who was waiting for a blow to fall. Miss Marple noticed a small, framed photograph on the desk, the same one she had seen in the archives. It showed Helena and her brother Arthur, smiling in front of the manor gates, but there was a third person in the photo, someone whose face had been carefully scratched out with a sharp nib. "Good afternoon, Helena," Miss Marple said, leaning over the garden gate. "I was just admiring your roses. They've held out so well against the frost." Helena started, dropping her pen. "Oh, Miss Marple, you quite startled me. I was just thinking." "The mind is a busy place, my dear," Miss Marple replied, "especially when one is thinking of the past. I was just over by your brother's grave. It's a lovely spot, so peaceful. I remember Sir George was very helpful to your family after the accident, wasn't he? Provided the funds for the memorial, if I recall." Helena's face didn't soften. It hardened into a mask of cold, brittle iron. "Sir George didn't provide anything that didn't serve his own interests, Miss Marple. He bought our silence." "But silence is a very expensive thing to maintain over 12 years. Eventually the debt becomes too high." Miss Marple nodded as if she were hearing a simple weather report. "Yes, I suppose it does, especially when a man decides to stop paying and start talking instead. That speech of his, it was a very dangerous opening, wasn't it?" Helena said nothing, but her knuckles were white as she gripped the edge of her desk. Miss Marple saw the flicker of a memory in the girl's eyes, a memory of the squire's face as he prepared to reveal the secrets of the village. It wasn't Dickie Tarrant's mother who was being evicted. It was Helena Crane who was being exposed. Sir George hadn't been poisoned because of a rent dispute. He had been killed because he was about to tell the village exactly how Arthur Crane had died and who had been in the boat with him that summer afternoon. Miss Marple bid the schoolmistress a pleasant evening and continued her walk. The white powder detail was now clear. It wasn't digital. It was a chemical trap set by someone with access to a dark room and a motive that spanned a decade of resentment. But she needed more than a scent and a scratched-out photograph. She needed to know who had the technical skill to create such a compound. The village was still sleeping under the comfort of Dickie Tarrant's arrest, but Miss Marple knew the truth was much more domestic and much more tragic. The hidden clue was the mismatched socks of Mr. Cherrington, the photographic scent on the wood, and the scratched face in a 12-year-old photograph. The squire had died because he was a bully who had finally decided to play with a secret that didn't belong to him. And in St. Mary Mead, secrets were protected with a ruthlessness that would have shocked the city-bred Inspector Slack. The following afternoon, Miss Marple found herself in the unlikely position of taking tea with Adelaide Abernathy, the squire's niece, in the cavernous, somewhat draughty drawing-room of Abernathy Manor. The house felt like a museum of vanished glories, filled with heavy Victorian furniture and the looming portraits of ancestors who all seemed to possess Sir George's prominent chin and judgmental stare. Adelaide, a sharp-featured woman in her late 30s with eyes that never seemed to rest, was not the grieving relative one might expect. She moved through the room with a brisk, almost predatory energy, accompanied by her solicitor, Mr. Gaunt, a man whose smile reminded Miss Marple of a very tidy shark. Miss Marple sat amidst the velvet cushions, her knitting needles clicking as she listened to the pair discuss the unfortunate nature of Sir George's end. To the village, Adelaide was the lucky heir, but Miss Marple knew inheritance was often a double-edged sword. She had seen it many times in St. Mary Mead, the way a legacy could be a lifeline or a noose, depending on the debts hidden beneath the surface. "My uncle was a man of the old school," Adelaide remarked, tapping a cigarette against a silver case. "He believed he could manage everyone's lives from this house. He didn't realize the world had moved on. He was obsessed with his records, his black book as he called it. He spent his final weeks locked in the study, muttering about cleaning up the parish once and for all." "A black book?" Miss Marple inquired, her voice a soft, interested flutter. "How very dramatic. It sounds like something from a penny dreadful. I suppose the police have taken it?" Mr. Gaunt cleared his throat, a dry, rasping sound. "Actually, Miss Marple, the book appears to be missing. We've searched the study thoroughly. It seems Sir George carried it with him to the square. It wasn't found on his person, which leads us to believe that whoever committed this act took the book to cover their own tracks." Miss Marple noted the way Adelaide's eyes darted toward the heavy mahogany desk. It was the look of someone who knew exactly where a thing was, but was frustrated that someone else had gotten there first. It became clear that the manor was not a house of mourning, but a house of secrets. Adelaide and Mr. Gaunt were not just heirs, they were people who had been living on the squire's allowance, an allowance that Sir George had threatened to cut off only a month prior when he discovered Mr. Gaunt's creative handling of the estate's trust funds. Leaving the manor, Miss Marple took the long way back through the village, stopping at the apothecary's once more. Mr. Cherrington was behind the counter, looking even more haggard than the previous day. The mismatched socks were gone, replaced by a pair of sombre grey, but his hands were stained with a dark chemical residue that he kept trying to hide beneath the counter. Miss Marple didn't ask for medicine. She asked for a very specific type of developing fluid, claiming she had taken up photography in her twilight years. "I'm afraid I'm out of stock, Miss Marple," Cherrington said, his voice brittle. "There's been a run on supplies lately. Everyone seems to have taken an interest in the darkroom." "How curious," Miss Marple replied, her eyes settling on a small ledger on the counter. "I suppose in a village this quiet, we all need a little something to occupy our time. Though, I must say, Sir George's hobby was much more dangerous. He liked to collect people's pasts. I remember he was very interested in the circumstances surrounding your predecessor's sudden retirement, Mr. Cherrington. Something about a mislabeled prescription, wasn't it? Sir George had a marvellous memory for such things." The apothecary's face went the colour of wood ash. He turned away to straighten a row of bottles that were already perfectly aligned. Miss Marple had her answer. The web of motives was far more intricate than Inspector Slack's simple theory of an evicted boy. The squire hadn't just been a landlord, he had been a master of leverage. He held the schoolmistress by the memory of her brother's death, the apothecary by a professional scandal, and his own niece by the threat of disinheritance. As she reached her own gate, Miss Marple saw Helena Crane standing by the schoolhouse fence. The girl looked like she hadn't slept in days. The secrets Sir George had been about to reveal weren't just about one person, they were a collective history of the village's hidden failures. Squire had intended his Harvest Festival speech to be a final public demonstration of his power, a way to remind everyone in St. Mary Mead that he owned their reputations as surely as he owned the land they lived on. "It's a very dangerous thing, Helena," Miss Marple said, as if they were continuing a conversation from hours ago, "to be the only person who knows everything. It makes one feel very safe, until one realizes that it makes everyone else feel very unsafe. And when people are frightened for their lives or their livelihoods, they can be capable of quite extraordinary things." Helena looked at her, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. He was going to name names, Miss Marple. He had the list in that book. He said it was time for the harvest to begin. He didn't care who he hurt. Miss Marple watched the girl leave. The pieces were shifting into a new and terrifying pattern. Murder was not a crime of passion, nor was it a crime of greed. It was a crime of communal self-defense. But only one person had the cold, clinical mind to turn that fear into a death trap. Only one person knew how to use the squire's own habits against him, and only one person had been close enough to the dais to see the white powder vanish. The following morning, a new and chilling development rippled through the village, threatening to turn the existing investigation on its head. It began when the verger went to open the church and found the lich gate defaced with a single word scrawled in white chalk, silenced. But the true shock came from the manor house. Adelaide Abernathy's solicitor, the sharp-featured Mr. Gaunt, was found slumped in his car at the edge of the estate, unconscious and suffering from what appeared to be a severe case of carbon monoxide poisoning. A hose had been crudely attached to the exhaust pipe, and a note was found on the dashboard, seemingly written by Gaunt, confessing to the murder of Sir George out of financial desperation. Inspector Slack was jubilant. To him, this was the ultimate vindication. Two suspects, the boy with the motive and the lawyer with the means, and now a suicide attempt that served as a confession. He immediately began making arrangements to release Dickie Tarrant, declaring to anyone who would listen that the pressure of the investigation had finally cracked the real culprit. The village breathed a sigh of collective, if somewhat bewildered, relief. It was the perfect ending to a nasty business. The outsider had done it, tried to kill himself, and the village's own bad boy was innocent after all. Miss Marple, however, sat in her garden with a look of profound distress. She was not a woman who believed in coincidences that occurred with such theatrical timing. She took a bus to the county town, ostensibly to visit a draper, but she spent her afternoon at the hospital where Mr. Gaunt was being treated under police guard. Through a series of gentle inquiries and a well-placed comment to a nurse about her nephew's unfortunate struggle with melancholy, she learned a vital detail. Mr. Gaunt's hands were perfectly clean. There was not a trace of the soot or grease one would expect from a man who had spent 10 minutes wrestling with a hot exhaust pipe and a length of garden hose. Returning to St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple found the village in a state of celebratory fervour. Even the apothecary, Mr. Cherrington, seemed to have found a new spring in his step, his shop window now bright with displays of autumn tonics. But Miss Marple went straight to the schoolhouse. She found Helena Crane standing in the middle of the empty classroom, staring at the chalk-dusty blackboard. "It's a very dangerous thing, my dear, to believe that a mystery can be solved with a second crime," Miss Marple said, her voice echoing in the quiet room. "Mr. Gaunt did not try to take his own life. He is a man who loves himself too much for such a gesture. He was silenced, just as the lich gate said, but he was not silenced because he killed the squire. He was silenced because he found the black book, wasn't he? And he tried to use it to blackmail the person who actually set the trap on the dais." Helena turned, her eyes wide and glassy. "I don't know what you're talking about, Miss Marple. The inspector says it's over. He says we can all go back to the way things were." "But things can never go back, Helena," Miss Marple replied softly. "That is the tragedy of it. Someone in this village thought they could save everyone by removing Sir George. They thought killing one bully could protect a dozen secrets. But murder isn't a protector, it's an infection. It spreads. It forced that person to try and kill Mr. Gaunt because he was just as greedy as the squire, and it will force them to kill again when the next person notices a detail that doesn't fit." Miss Marple walked to the blackboard and picked up a piece of white chalk. She looked at it for a long moment. It was the same chalk used to deface the gate, the same chalk used in every schoolroom in England. But it wasn't the chalk that interested her. It was the person who had the most to lose if the squire had spoken. She thought of the Mackintosh man again. He hadn't been a stranger or a hired assassin. He had been a ghost from the past, the brother who was supposed to have drowned 12 years ago. The revelation hit her with the force of a physical blow. Arthur Crane hadn't died in that rowing accident. He had been the one who survived, and Sir George had helped him disappear to avoid a scandal that would have ruined the Abernathy reputation. For 12 years, Helena had lived a lie, believing her brother was dead while the squire used that secret to keep her in a state of perpetual debt. But Arthur had returned, a broken man in a frayed Mackintosh, seeking the sister he had lost. Sir George's speech wasn't going to expose a crime. It was going to expose the fact that the heroic drowning was a sham, and Helena's quiet, respectable life as a schoolmistress would have been shattered by the truth of her brother's cowardice. The twist was now clear. The killer wasn't trying to hide their own guilt. They were trying to protect the one person they loved, and in doing so they had become the very thing they hated. Miss Marple looked at Helena, seeing not a murderer but a victim who had finally struck back. But she also knew that the person who had actually mixed the chemicals, the person who had the knowledge and the steady hand, was not the girl standing before her. It was the man who had always been in the background, the man who had watched Helena grow up and had loved her with a silent, desperate devotion. As she left the schoolhouse, Miss Marple knew she had the final piece. The mystery wasn't about the squire at all. It was about the lengths to which a quiet man would go to protect a woman's peace. She needed to set one final test, a psychological game that would force the killer to reveal themselves. The village thought the drama was over, but for Jane Marple, the hardest part was just beginning. The following afternoon, the air in St. Mary Mead was thick with a pre-storm stillness that felt like a held breath. Most of the village was at the Blue Boar, celebrating the news that Dickie Tarrant was to be released within the hour. But Miss Marple was not among them. Instead, she had sent a small, neatly penned note to the apothecary, Mr. Cherrington, asking him to meet her in the schoolroom for a matter of urgent historical importance regarding the Abernathy estate. It was a summons he could not easily refuse without drawing the very attention he sought to avoid. When Mr. Cherrington entered the classroom, he found Miss Marple sitting at a small student desk, her knitting needles idle for once. She had placed a single object in the centre of the teacher's desk, a small silver picture frame, its glass cracked, containing a photo of a young man on a riverbank. Cherrington stopped in the doorway, his face ashen, his hand instinctively gripping the doorframe. The chemical stains on his fingers seemed darker, more accusatory in the flat afternoon light. "It is a tragedy, is it not, Mr. Cherrington?" Miss Marple began, her voice a soft melodic chirp that didn't quite hide the steel beneath. "The way the past refuses to stay under water. I was just thinking about that summer 12 years ago. Such a bright, hot summer. It must have been very difficult for you, being the one to tell poor Helena that her brother was gone. You were always so fond of her even then, like a father, or perhaps something more protective." Cherrington moved slowly toward the desk, his eyes fixed on the photograph. "I don't know why you've brought me here, Miss Marple. The case is closed. Mr. Gaunt has confessed. The inspector is satisfied. Inspector Slack is a man who sees a finished jigsaw puzzle and doesn't notice that several pieces have been trimmed with scissors to make them fit, Miss Marple replied, her blue eyes narrowing. Mr. Gaunt did not confess. He was a greedy man, but he was a cowardly one. He found Sir George's black book, the one Arthur Crane returned to retrieve, and he realized he could make more money from you than he could from the estate. He didn't realize that a man who has already committed one murder to protect someone he loves will not hesitate to commit a second to finish the job. Miss Marple stood up, her small frame surprisingly imposing in the quiet room. You see, Mr. Cherrington, I know about darkroom chemicals. I know about the way they can be mixed to create a powder that vanishes when it meets the sweat of a nervous man's palm. And I know that Sir George didn't just have secrets about the village. He had the secret of your own heart. He knew that you had helped Arthur Crane disappear all those years ago because you couldn't bear to see Helena's brother hanged for the accidental death of that Abernathy boy in the boat. Sir George held that over you for a decade, using your skill and your shop as his own personal laboratory. The apothecary's breathing became ragged, a harsh whistling sound in the silence. Miss Marple reached into her bag and pulled out a small piece of white chalk, the same kind she had seen Helena using. But the secrets Sir George was going to reveal at the festival weren't about Arthur. He had grown bored of that game. He had found out about your creative dispensing of certain tonics to the elderly ladies of the parish, tonics that kept them dependent and kept your books in the black. He was going to ruin you, Mr. Cherrington, and in ruining you he would have left Helena with no one to protect her from the truth of her brother's return. He was a devil, Cherrington whispered, his voice cracking. He sat there in that manner like a spider. He did not care about people here. He only cared about the leverage. I did it for her. I did it so she could keep her school, her respectability. I couldn't let him tear her world down just because he was bored with his own. Miss Marple watched him closely. This was the moment, the subtle psychological game. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. But there is one thing that puzzles me, Mr. Cherrington, a small detail that a man of your precision would surely have considered. If you killed him to protect Helena, why did you leave the black book in the schoolhouse? I found it this morning, tucked behind the radiator. If the police find it there, they won't think of you. They will think Helena was the one who wanted him dead. They will think the schoolmistress killed Squire to hide her brother's cowardice. The reaction was instantaneous. Cherrington's eyes widened, with a primal, desperate terror. No, it's not there. I burned it. I burned every page in the furnace at the back of the shop. He lunged forward, his hands grasping at the air as if he could take the words back. Miss Marple stepped back, her expression shifting from gentleness to a grim, judicial solemnity. Why, no, you did, Mr. Cherrington. Behind the radiator was no book. But a man who has burned a piece of evidence doesn't react with such horror unless he knows exactly what that evidence contained, and why he had to destroy it. You didn't just kill Helena. You were killed because you were the only one who knew how, and you thought you were clever enough to make the village believe in a ghost in a mackintosh. The door to the cloakroom creaked open, and Inspector Slack stepped out, his face a mask of stunned disbelief, followed by a pale, trembling Dickie Tarrant. Miss Marple hadn't just been talking to a suspect, she had been providing a confession for a hidden audience. I believe, Miss Marple said, picking up her knitting bag and smoothing her skirts, that you will find the garden hose and the rest of the chemicals in the shed behind the apothecary shop. It is very sad, Mr. Cherrington. You tried to build a wall of protection around someone you loved, but you built it out of poison and lies, and in the end, those are the very things that bring the walls down. The sun had begun to dip behind the spire of the village church, casting long violet shadows across the square where the tragedy had begun. The schoolroom, usually a place of chalk dust and youthful ambition, had become a courtroom of sorts. Inspector Slack stood by the window, looking uncharacteristically humbled, while Mr. Cherrington sat collapsed in a small wooden chair, his head in his hands. The arrival of the vicar and Mrs. Bantry, who had been waiting anxiously at the gate, signalled that the time for the final accounting had come. Miss Marple, ever composed, remained standing at the head of the room, ready to untangle the threads she had so methodically pulled. "It is a common mistake," Miss Marple began, her voice steady and clear, "to assume that a crime must be as complicated as the motives behind it. In reality, a murder is often a very simple action born of a very complex situation. We were all led to believe that Sir George was killed because of a rent dispute or a financial scandal. But Sir George was not killed for what he had done in the past, he was killed for what he was about to do in the present. He was about to use the truth as a blunt instrument to shatter the lives of people who had spent 12 years trying to mend them." She looked toward the inspector, who was still turning his notebook as if the words might rearrange themselves. "You see, Inspector, the clues were never in the mackintosh or the missing book. They were in the habits of the village. I noticed first the dusting of white powder on the dais. It was a very fine crystalline substance. Most people would have mistaken it for salt or sugar, but in the light of the apothecary's profession, it took on a much more sinister meaning. Mr. Charrington has a hobby of old-fashioned photography, which requires a deep knowledge of chemical reactions. He knew that by combining a specific developer with a caustic cleaning agent, he could create a contact poison. It didn't need to be in a glass of water, it only needed to be where Sir George would rest his hands." Miss Marple paused to adjust her shawl, the clicking of her needles absent but her mind still weaving the pattern. Then there was the issue of mismatched socks. To many it was a sign of grief. To me it was a sign of a man whose routine had been shattered by a desperate act. A man of precision like Mr. Charrington does not lose his focus over a simple death. He loses it over a murder he has committed himself. He was terrified that the powder wouldn't work, or that it would work too well and leave a trace. He was constantly checking his hands, which explains the chemical stains that wouldn't wash away. But the most important clue, she continued, was the behavior of the schoolmistress, Helena. She was terrified, yes, but not the police. Squire's speech horrified her. Sir George had discovered that Arthur Crane, Helena's brother, had not drowned 12 years ago. He had survived that boating accident, but in his panic he had allowed another boy to drown in his place. Sir George helped cover it up at the time to avoid a scandal for the estate, but he kept that knowledge over Mr. Charrington and Helena like a sword. When Arthur returned to the village as the man in the mackintosh, the squire realized his leverage was gone. He decided to destroy them all by exposing the village's secrets at the festival. Mrs. Bantry gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "So he killed him to save Helena's reputation?" "Precisely," Miss Marple nodded. "Mr. Charrington has loved this girl since she was a child. He couldn't stand to see her ruined by her brother's cowardice or the squire's cruelty. He set the trap on the dais. But then Mr. Gaunt, the solicitor, found the diary, the black book, in the chaos. Gaunt was a businessman, and he saw an opportunity for blackmail. He realized what Charrington had done and tried to squeeze him for money. That is why Mr. Charrington had to stage the suicide. He used his knowledge of chemicals to sedate Gaunt and then rigged the exhaust pipe. But he was in a hurry, and he forgot that a man working with a car and a garden hose would necessarily get his hands dirty. Mr. Gaunt's hands were clean, meaning someone else had done the work for him. The inspector cleared his throat, looking at the broken man in the chair. "And the book, Miss Marple? You said he burned it." "He did," she confirmed sadly. "He had to. It contained the proof of his own illegal dispensing of tonics, and the truth about Arthur Crane. By burning it, he thought he had erased the motive, but he forgot that a motive lives in the heart long after the paper is gone. He reacted to the mere mention of that book because it was the ghost that haunted him. He killed to keep the village quiet, not realizing that a village is never quiet once blood has been spilled." The room fell silent. Dickie Tarrant, who had been standing awkwardly by the door, looked at the apothecary with a mixture of pity and anger. He was the one who was supposed to go to jail, and all because a respectable man couldn't bear the truth. It is a very old story, Miss Marple concluded, picking up her bag. It reminds me of the old postmaster in St. Mary Mead who used to read everyone's letters. He thought he was the village master because he knew everyone's business, but knowledge without kindness is very dangerous. Mr. Cherrington thought he was being kind to Helena, but you cannot find kindness in a bottle of poison. As the constable stepped forward to lead Mr. Cherrington away, Miss Marple turned to the window. The storm was finally breaking, the first heavy drops of rain hitting the glass. The truth had been harvested, and while it was a bitter crop, the village was finally free of the squire's shadow. She felt a deep weariness in her bones. It was time to go home and put the kettle on. The rain that had threatened all afternoon finally descended upon St. Mary Mead, not with a roar, but with a steady, rhythmic persistence that seemed to wash the dust from the cobblestones and the tension from the air. The next morning the village square was as clean as a new slate. The police cars had gone, taking Mr. Cherrington to a cell in the county town, and the cordons around the dais had been removed, leaving only a faint rectangular outline on the stones where the wooden structure had once stood. To the casual traveller passing through, it was once again the picture of a sleepy English hamlet, undisturbed by the darker currents of the human soul. Miss Marple sat in her favourite chair by the window of her cottage, her knitting needles clicking once more in their familiar, comforting cadence. The wool was a soft heather blue, intended for a sweater for her nephew Raymond. Outside, the garden was recovering from the storm, the chrysanthemums standing a little straighter now that the heavy heat had broken. Beside her, a small tray held a pot of tea and a single piece of seed cake. It was the picture of a quiet, uneventful old age, yet the mind behind the spectacles was far from idle. She was thinking of Helena Crane. The schoolmistress had resigned her position that morning, intending to leave the village with the stranger in the mackintosh. Arthur Crane would not face charges. The events of 12 years ago were a tangle of civil negligence and the squire's own illegal interference, but he could not stay in St. Mary Mead. He and Helena were bound for a new life in the north, where their names carried no weight and their pasts were not etched into the local headstones. Miss Marple felt a flicker of hope for them. They were finally free of the squire's ledger, though the price of that freedom had been the soul of the apothecary who had loved them too well. "It is a strange thing, Jane," Mrs. Bantry said, having dropped by to share the latest news from the manor. "Adelaide is selling the estate. She says she can't bear the silence of that house now that George is gone. She's moving back to London to open an art gallery. Even the solicitor, Mr. Gaunt, has decided to retire to the coast once he fully recovers. It's as if the squire's death has cleared out the whole nest." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes fixed on a dropped stitch which she expertly retrieved. "When a great tree falls, Dolly, it always clears a space in the forest. Some things will grow better in the sunlight that remains, while others, I fear, were only held up by the tree itself." Sir George was a man who lived by the shadow he cast. Without him, many people found they didn't know how to stand on their own. The conversation in the village had already begun to shift. The secrets of the square were being replaced by the injustice of the apothecary. There was a collective sense of betrayal, not just because Mr. Cherrington had killed, but because he had used his position of trust, the man who healed their ailments, to deliver death. It was a violation of the village social contract that hurt more than the squire's bullying ever had. Even Mrs. Price Ridley had grown quiet, her appetite for scandal momentarily dampened by the realization that she had been buying her aspirin from a double murderer for years. "Do you think people ever really change, Jane?" Mrs. Bantry asked, looking out at the rain-washed garden. "Or are we all just waiting for the right or wrong circumstances to show who we truly are?" Miss Marple paused, her needles stilling for a moment. "I think, my dear, that we are very much like the plants in my garden. Under the right conditions, with enough light and water, we grow straight and true. But if we are crowded, or if the soil is sour, or if someone constantly treads upon us, we twist. Mr. Cherrington was a man who had been twisted by a secret for 12 years. He thought he was being a martyr, but a martyr who kills is merely a criminal with a better excuse. Human nature is not a fixed thing. It is a series of choices, and unfortunately, once you choose the path of deceit, it becomes very hard to find your way back to the main road. She thought of the white powder on the dais and the way it had vanished in the moisture of the squire's hands. It was a perfect metaphor for the secrets of St. Mary Mead. They seemed solid and powerful until the light of day, or the persistence of an old woman, made them dissolve into nothing. The squire had died because he thought his knowledge made him a god. The apothecary had killed because he thought his love made him a judge. Both had forgotten that in the end they were merely men, subject to the same laws of morality as the boy who lived in the cottage by the tracks. As the evening bells began to toll for the vesper service, Miss Marple stood up and smoothed her skirts. The village was returning to normal, but it was a wiser, sadder normalcy. Dickie Tarrant had been seen helping the vicar fix the lich gate, the silenced chalk mark scrubbed away by the rain. There was a sense of a fresh start, however fragile. Miss Marple took her tea tray and carried it to the kitchen. She had finished the row on her knitting, and the mystery of the harvest festival was safely tucked away in her memory, alongside the postmaster who read letters and the gardener who loved his roses too much. "Order is a very precious thing, Dolly," she said softly as she saw her friend at the door. "We must cherish it while we have it, for underneath the peace of a village square there is always the heart, and the heart is a very unpredictable organ indeed." She watched Mrs. Bantry's car lights disappear into the dusk. The house was quiet. The only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Jane Marple sat back down, picked up her needles and began the next row. There would be other mysteries, other villages, and other secrets. But for tonight, the wool was soft, the tea was warm, and the world, at least her small corner of it, was once again as it should be.